Well, our reading here, aggregate output, prices, and economic growth is action-packed. It's a bit of a challenging reading. I think we've got 14 learning outcome statements here. We'll cover it with about 40 slides, but as I say, some of the material is kind of challenging. We'll start out defining some of the measures of aggregate output and then look at a model. Really was built off something Keynes wrote as interpreted by Hicks, this ISLM curves, as a way of generating the aggregate demand curve, which is what we're really after. Once we get an aggregate demand curve for the whole economy, we'll take a look at short-run aggregate supply, short-term and long-term aggregate supply for the economy, and talk about equilibrium and how some of these things move together. And then we'll wrap it up with just a little bit on growth economics and how capital and labor interact to generate output or output per capita. So let's jump in with some definitions. We'll start off with our most straightforward one, I guess, GDP, gross domestic product. And that first line says it all, but then we got to look at a few things. Market value of all final goods and services produced in a country's economy. So one reason we're taking final goods and services, we don't want to look at intermediate goods, parts made as part of a jet engine or something like this. Well, the value of those is going to be captured in the final price of the jet engine. So we don't look at any intermediate goods. We're only going to look at goods that are valued in the marketplace, that we've got market prices on, with a couple of exceptions here at the bottom of this list. And we're going to talk about things produced during the period. You'll notice at one point we adjust for changes in inventory, because if we looked at everything purchased in the economy during the period, but more was produced so that inventories built up, we got to look at that change in inventory to capture those products that were produced but not sold during the period, whether it's a quarter or a year or whatever. So we also want to include the rental value of owner-occupied housing, because people that own their own houses, well, these are productive assets. These are physical assets, and they produce economic benefit, housing services. So even though it's owned by the user of those services, we still want to value those services as output when calculating GDP. And we value also government services, but not at their value because they're not traded, but we value them at cost. And the last note here says not transfers, and that's just refer to the fact that some government spending is transfer payments, whether it's unemployment or Social Security, retirement benefits, or disability benefits, or welfare, or anything like that. Those are all transfer payments, and so that's just shifting around to the wealth, not the creation of economic value, so we're not going to count those when calculating gross domestic product. And so, as you may have figured by now, there's two ways we can approach calculating this GDP. We can either look at the incomes of all the factors of production. So this is the earnings of households, earnings of businesses, and government income through taxation. We can look at all that income and add it up. And interest income, dividend income. So housing services, as I mentioned, this is all coming from our stock of physical capital and labor. Now, another way to look at it would be to look at the expenditures. Add up all the market values of all the final goods and services produced in the economy, or sum the increases in value. Now, the point here is we can take either approach statistically, either looking at all the incomes or all the expenditures. And these should be the same theoretically. There'll be statistical discrepancies between the two just because the numbers are never as clear as what you would like. But those two approaches get us to the same thing, GDP. Now, these 2 points under expenditures approach, all we're saying here is if we take the final price of the good, that will include all the additions to value as it moved through the productive process. And we'll have an example of that in just a minute. So GDP calculated either by the income or the expenditures approach. If we add them all up and do it right, they should be equal. Now this is, you can write big deal on your slide right here, and I'll write it on mine. It's not that hard to do. This is a big deal. This equation here says GDP from the expenditures approach is the spending of consumers, the spending of businesses on investment in physical capital, raw materials, all of that, and government spending. And then net exports, X minus M. So we call this often net X. And when we add up all those sources, that's all the expenditures in the economy. And the reason I put that this is a big deal, we're going to use this. We're going to use this to understand how changes in these various components of GDP change the economic equilibrium. Now, I mentioned that if we add the value added at each stage of the production process, we come up with the sum, right? The sum of the value added. Well, over here on the left, we've got value added at each stage. So the materials are $1.21 here, or 1.21 pounds. The fabrication, 2 pounds 18 pence. Assembly, 3.38. And so if we add all those up, we get to this same amount right here. So these are received at each stage, so the value added, $1.21. In the first stage, 97 cents. The difference between these. And the difference between these is 120. And then to get to the final consumer, we get up to 176. So I didn't mean to say we summed the left-hand column. Those are all the values of the goods as we're moving through the production process. If we add up the value added on the right-hand side, we get that same amount. So 2 ways to get to the same number. Okay, now let's look at nominal versus real GDP. When we talk about nominal GDP, we're talking about in dollars or in yen or whatever the currency units are. And we said, well, it's the final goods of all final goods, their prices times their quantities. So that's simply what we have here. Sum up the quantity times the price for everything produced in the economy over that period, or all final goods and services produced in the economy over that period, and add them up. So that's nominal GDP. But because of inflation, that might be growing even if the real output, the quantity of goods and services being produced in the economy, has not increased. If we have 3% a year inflation, then nominal GDP would go up 3% a year, even if we produced exactly the same goods and services as the prior period. So that's not the measure we want. We want real GDP. Well, real GDP tries to answer the question of how much more stuff was produced, not how much more dollar value or euro value was produced. And real GDP has to be measured relative to some base period. So you pick a base period and then say, okay, compared to that period, how much more or less stuff was produced in the economy? And so the way we do this calculation is we use the prices from the base year. So if we're looking at 2012 and we want to see the real growth from 2007, let's see, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Yeah, that's 5 years of growth there. And so what we would do is use the 2007 prices on the 2012 output mix. So we haven't got any inflation in there now. And so the real output we can measure that way using base year prices. And then that allows us to calculate something called the GDP deflator. Now this is an index number like the CPI number. We multiply it by 100, and in the base period it's set equal to 100. Because in the base period, nominal GDP and real GDP, in reference to what I was talking about on the last slide, right? If we have nominal GDP and we have real GDP both using 2007 prices, then that ratio is just 1 to start with. So the GDP deflator starts out at 100 in the base year. Now, in this example here, we use base year 5 years ago, and our deflator is 112.3, 112.3. Well, since we've multiplied it by 100, all that's telling us is that prices overall, at least according to this measure, have gone up 12.3% over that 5-year period. So how would we use that? Well, if we were given nominal GDP for 2012, and we've got this GDP deflator of 112.3 over this period 2007-2012, we just divide that by 100, right? So if this measure of inflation says prices are up 12.3% over that 5-year period, we can use nominal GDP, even if it's not for the whole economy. We might even have sectors where we think this deflator is an adequate measure of the price changes over time. Well, we would just end up dividing by 1 plus 12.3%. So it's just that index number divided by 100. That's what we divide by to get real GDP from nominal GDP. Well, we're going to define a couple more types of income. Now, GDP is our best measure of economic activity in an economy, in a country. But we also have use for some other measures here. Now, GDP, it says here, equals national income plus capital consumption allowance plus statistical discrepancy. Well, the statistical discrepancy is just because if we calculate it different ways, we're going to get different numbers. So don't worry too much about that. But you should understand what this capital consumption allowance is. So it's stuff that was produced that went to replace physical assets that were used up in the production process. So I think here we've got capital consumption allowance is the output that goes to replace the capital stock that's wearing out. So it's similar to the idea of at least economic depreciation of physical productive capital goods. So if we to calculate this national income, we start with employees' wages and benefits. Okay, we're looking at the income side now. Corporate and government profits pre-tax, interest income, unincorporated business owners' income. Well, if we have a corporation, we've got corporate profits, okay? If we've got a government enterprise, there may be profits made on that. Well, we want to include that here, but some businesses aren't incorporated. Could be a sole proprietorship or a partnership. Well, we want the business owner's income there, too. I mean, a business owner may pay himself or herself wages, and that would be up in employee wages and benefits. But the business owner also gets the residual income to the extent that there's profits beyond wages, and we want to include that too. We want to include rents in there, and we want to add indirect business taxes and subtract subsidies, because these taxes and subsidies are included in the in final prices. Now, indirect business taxes, as opposed to an income tax, are things like a sales tax or a value-added tax or something like that. So we want to add those taxes on, income to government, and subsidies are expenditures by government. So if the final price with a subsidy, we want to reduce it by that, because that was already counted in tax revenue that's being used to subsidize the production of some goods. I guess ethanol would be a good example where the government spending encourages the production of ethanol to mix with your gasoline. Okay, personal income is national income, that whole list we had, plus transfer payments. So transfer payments to household end up as personal income. So if you're getting a Social Security benefit from the government, an unemployment benefit from the government, this goes into personal income. But now we're going to subtract out these indirect business taxes, because they don't go to individuals. We're going to subtract out corporate income taxes because they don't go to individuals either, and any undistributed corporate profits. Remember, corporations can pay out some of their profits, or all of them, I suppose, as dividends. That is personal income. But to the extent they retain earnings and don't pay it out to the shareholders, that's undistributed corporate profits. These are not paid out to people, so we want to subtract them from this whole big thing, national income, in getting down to personal income. And the main thing we want personal income for is to calculate personal disposable income, and we just want to subtract off personal taxes there. So it's the after-tax income of the population. Well, the reason we like that, it's a good indicator of consumer spending. When disposable incomes are going up, people spend more. When they're going down, they spend less. So that's why it's a pretty good indicator and something that economists like to watch, especially those that are trying to predict changes in overall GDP. So remember the big deal relationship here? GDP equals consumer spending plus business spending on investment plus government plus net exports. Exports minus imports. That's our expenditures approach. From the total income approach, we've got taxes rather than government spending. We've got savings by consumers, and we've got consumer spending. So, of all the GDP, what do people do with it? Well, they either consume with it, or they save it, or they send it off to the government in the form of taxes. So we're going to take these two and we're going to put them together and cross out those C's are going to cancel out. We subtract that from both sides, and this is what we end up with. We do just a little bit of rearrangement on this and end up with this right here. So this is kind of a big deal too. We'll see this in a couple of forms. So let me just go over what that tells us. It says that savings equal business investment spending, and I think I said earlier something about raw materials with relation to investment spending, and I didn't mean to. So I take that all back. This is spending by businesses on physical goods for production, their capital stock. And then we put those other four terms in parentheses. So we've got G minus T. What's that? Well, that's government spending minus the taxes they take in. And so government spending minus the taxes they take in, that's the federal budget deficit. At least when it's positive it is, because spending is greater than taxes. And that's usually the situation. We saw a surplus in the U.S. briefly many years ago, maybe 2002. And since then, it's been deficit spending around the world. So that's the federal deficit, and then exports minus imports, that's net exports. So we're saying that savings can go in a number of places, but it's a fixed number of places. It either goes for business investment, or it goes to buy government bonds to fund the deficit, or it could go to fund this exports over imports. So there is that other big deal relationship that we're going to see. Savings equals investment plus fiscal balance plus trade balance. Okay? So this slide basically says what I just said. They're either invested, used to finance government subsidy, or used to fund a trade surplus. Now, of course, G minus T could be negative, X minus M. If we have more imports than we have exports, we have a trade deficit, that could be negative as well. But I just word it this way to give you a little intuition and hopefully make this easier to remember. Okay, so now we get to something, you see this IS curve, and this is probably the toughest part of the material in this reading. But as far as what's required by the learning outcome statement, we really need to just know, for purposes of the exam, how this IS curve and these LM curves create an aggregate demand curve. That's what we're after. So the overall point of view here is that this IS curve is equilibrium in the goods market. So when income equals planned expenditures, expenditures equal income, that's our equilibrium in the goods market. Our IS curve is going to show us different equilibrium points across the economy in the goods market. The LM curve we're going to look at is the liquidity money curve. That's equilibrium in the money market. And so we've got equilibrium in the goods market, equilibrium in the money market, and then we're going to see where they cross, and that's an overall equilibrium in both markets. So let's take a look at this IS curve first. Increase in income increases savings more than it increases investment. So savings minus investment is a positive number. It's going to increase with income. So this part right here increases with income. Now, increase in income decreases the fiscal deficit. Why is that? Because tax revenues go up. Higher the income, more people paying taxes. We hold G constant, and we see that fiscal deficit, okay, is decreased, and exports minus imports, if we look at that whole term and say that's decreasing as well. Okay. So now we've got the left-hand side that goes up with income and the right-hand side that goes down with income. So how are we going to maintain this when incomes change? Well, to derive this IS curve, and again, this is not strictly required by the learning outcome statement, but it's in the curriculum materials, and it gives you an idea where where these come from. So we did that. We got this relationship here for one particular interest rate, a real interest rate of 5%. And so we've plotted this S minus I, savings minus investment, versus real aggregate income in the society, in the economy. And so here is our equilibrium. This amount of aggregate income, this is probably animated anyway, so I'll do it that way. Oops. Okay, so that's our level of aggregate income where there's equilibrium in the goods market for a real rate of 5%. So that's one equilibrium point for a real rate of return of 5%. Now, if we increase this real interest rate of 5%, and hold these constant, investment has to decrease, right? Real interest rates go up, businesses find less profitable opportunities because their costs of funds is higher. So some projects that looked attractive and profitable don't look so attractive and profitable when your costs of money to fund those goes up. But savings must also decrease. Well, that's a problem, because when income goes up, savings goes up. But when real interest rates go up, savings goes up as well. So the only way we can maintain this balance, okay, after an increase in the real interest rate is for equilibrium income to decrease. Well, this is a long way around to telling us that at a higher real rate, our equilibrium is going to be at a lower level of aggregate income. And then we can also look at a lower interest rate and see that our equilibrium level of real output would be higher with a lower real rate. So now what are we describing? Remember, we're trying to derive this IS curve that shows the relationship, in this case, between real interest rates and aggregate output. So now we have three values we've plotted here. We've plotted the value of aggregate income. So here's our pairs, right? Aggregate income at equilibrium for each level of real interest rates. And once we have that done, we come up with this IS curve. So we plot those real interest rates on the y-axis. We plot the corresponding levels of aggregate income on the x-axis, get our points, hook them together, and that's our IS curve or line. Now, if that derivation wasn't too much fun for you, and I can't imagine that it is, your takeaway here is that the IS curve slopes downward. In the goods market, lower real interest rate leads to higher real income. So that's not a hard story to remember. Lower real interest rates spur economic activity in the goods market. So that's our IS curve. So now we need to talk about our LM curve. We need to talk about equilibrium in the money market. We're going to define the real money supply as just the nominal money supply, M, divided by the price level, right? So at higher prices, if we keep the nominal money supply constant, the real money supply falls as prices increase. And we think money demand is essentially a function of two things: real interest rate and incomes. When incomes are up, people want to hold more money. They want to hold more money for transactions purposes primarily. Now, real rates is the cost of holding money. The important thing to think about here is think of money as being non-interest bearing, and then think of bonds over here where you earn interest. Well, you need spendable money. What's the cost of that? Well, the cost of having that money around, that non-interest bearing money, is the interest you could have earned by investing in bonds. A little simplistic, but it works for our purposes here. So when real rates go up, the opportunity cost of holding money goes up. And when that cost goes up, quantity demanded decreases, just like for any other good. The cost of holding real money balances goes up. People are going to hold less in equilibrium. On the other hand, the other argument in our function, y, or income, is positively related to money demand. Higher incomes, higher money demand. Now, so we see higher real interest rates, we're going to have higher incomes. Now remember, on the IS curve, we just did the opposite. But here in the money market, we're saying, look, interest rates go up, quantity demanded of money goes down. In order to get that quantity demanded back up to whatever the quantity available in the economy is, incomes are going to have to rise. So just as we had a fairly complex argument for the slope of the IS curve, that's our fairly difficult explanation. And don't feel bad, these IS and LM curve models have been driving economic students crazy for the last 60-some years. But I think we can understand what's going on here. So now we got with that relationship, we said, well, incomes have to go up at higher interest rates in order to preserve equilibrium in the money market. So these are all equilibrium points in the money market, okay, for different real interest rates. So since the LM curve slopes up and the IS curve slopes down, we get an equilibrium here. And this point right here represents the real interest rate and real income equilibrium that is an equilibrium in the goods market because it's on the IS curve, and it's also an equilibrium in the money market because it's on the LM curve. So that's our LM and IS curve. So I want your takeaway to be from this is the LM slopes up, the IS slopes down. And what have we held constant? Well, we've held the nominal money supply constant. We've actually, in drawing that LM curve, we held the real money supply, M over P, constant. So now the story is, in order to get the aggregate demand curve, we're going to plot the LM curve, these money market equilibrium pairs, at a higher price level. We said the real money supply was M over P, price level up, this whole thing goes down. So at a higher price level, we've got a lower real money supply. If we decrease the real money supply, we get a new set of equilibria in the money markets, and that's this second LM curve here that intersects our IS curve right here. And we can also look what happens. Well, what if we decrease the price level so that we increase the real money supply? Well, then we get a different LM curve. So don't get too daunted by this. We had one LM curve and our IS curve. We started varying the real money supply, and we can get different LM curves and look at those intersections. So just as we did when we were constructing that IS curve, we can take these intersections, and now we want to plot the price level versus equilibrium real income. And we'll do that just by putting these pairs on. Now, the thing is, with the IS-LM model, we had real interest rates on the vertical axis, the y-axis. So please remember that. And then we tweak the price level to get an aggregate demand curve, because our aggregate demand curve shows real output demanded at different price levels. I'll spend just a little more time on that one, okay? So that is a long way around. So I don't want you to get too confused about that IS-LM. If you can remember so far, the IS curve shows the equilibria in the goods market. We can draw an LM curve for each level of the real money supply, plot out some points, and those points are the aggregate demand curve that shows the relationship between the price level and real aggregate income. So another way to say that is we kept the nominal money supply constant when we drew the LM curve, and then as we varied the price level, nominal money supply stayed the same, but prices up, real money supply down, prices down, real money supply up. That's how we got our aggregate demand curve. And this is what we were really after anyway, is a downward sloping aggregate demand that says, well, at lower price levels, aggregate demand, and what's aggregate demand? Well, C plus I plus G, government spending, plus net exports. That's what we've plotted here. So now we've got an aggregate demand curve for the whole economy. Now we need an aggregate supply curve. Well, we're going to define aggregate supply curve over 3 time horizons. In the very short run, aggregate supply doesn't change. Input quantities are fixed. Well, we're not concerned with the very short run. We're concerned with the short run and the long run. And how do we differentiate those in this model of the overall economy? Well, we're going to say in the short run, input prices are fixed, especially wages. So in the short run, we'll hold input prices fixed. And this seems a little odd because we're going to allow the prices of final goods, this price level on the y-axis, we're going to allow that to vary. But in the short run, we're going to hold input prices fixed. And primarily wages, but it could be other important inputs like energy. In the long run, these input prices can vary, and that's what's going to get us back into equilibrium, right? Disequilibrium is a short-run phenomenon. We get away from our long-run equilibrium, there's got to be some sort of mechanism to get us back. Well, that mechanism in this model is changes in input prices. We'll see when the economy is producing at a high level, an expansionary economy greater than full employment. This is going to put upward pressure on input prices. And when we're in recession, unemployment rises, we're at less than full employment GDP, then there's downward pressure on wages, as you could think of workers competing for jobs in a recession and companies competing for workers in an expansion. So that's how we get back to long-run equilibrium. Because in the long run, aggregate supply is fixed. We'll draw it as vertical, right? Perfectly inelastic. Because when we talk about full employment or potential real GDP, this aggregate supply depends on the amount and the quality of labor available in the economy, the capital stock that they have to work with, and at any point in time, the technology that's used to convert these other resources into final goods and services. So this is, if we had two big deal equations, this is our big deal graph here. Well, especially once we add aggregate demand back to it. So here's our vertical long-run aggregate supply. This is an upward sloping short-run aggregate supply. We held wages fixed in drawing this. Input prices fixed. Why is it upward sloping in the price level? Well, remember I said we're going to hold input prices fixed, but we're going to allow the prices of final goods and services to go up. That's the price level we're looking at on the y-axis. So think of yourself as a business owner. Your costs are staying the same for your inputs, and you see the price of your output going up. Profits are increasing. What do you want to do? You want to expand, and you want to produce more. So that's why this short-run aggregate supply curve is upward sloping. So let's talk about the aggregate demand, what moves that around, then we'll talk about what moves aggregate supply around, and then go back to our equilibrium model. Aggregate demand curve shows relationship between, and please remember what's on the axes. You don't understand the relationship being described in a curve unless you know what two things, at least in a two-dimensional graph, what two things are trading off and what the direction of the trade-off is. So it shows this negative relationship between price level and the real quantity of final goods and services demanded. And what are the components? Well, as I mentioned, our big deal equation, C plus I plus G plus net exports. That's the sources of demand: consumers, businesses, government, and net foreign demand. Shifts in aggregate demand. Well, now we can look at these various pieces and know what's going to shift aggregate demand. Increases in wealth increase consumer spending. When consumers feel richer, when the prices of their houses are going up, they feel richer, they spend more. If individuals' expectations or business expectations for economic growth increase, that's going to increase aggregate demand. When the future looks brighter, people spend more now. When the future looks brighter, businesses invest more now. And it's also true that when capacity utilization runs over above 85%, so that there's not much slack in the productive capacity, then businesses tend to increase their investment spending. Well, anything that increases or decreases, C plus I plus G, or affect net exports, can shift this aggregate demand curve. What do increases in the tax rates do? Well, increases in the tax rates lower personal disposable income, lower spending. So a decrease in demand from increases in tax rate. Increases in government spending, well, that's very direct. If G goes up, aggregate demand goes up. What about increases in the money supply? Well, increases in the money supply, holding prices constant, tend to reduce equilibrium real interest rates, and that's going to increase business spending, right? If I can borrow money more cheaply, there's more projects for expansion that look profitable. So business investment spending increases. What about consumer spending? Well, much of consumer spending, the large ticket items, are often purchased on credit, like homes, cars, appliances, home remodeling of various sorts, sometimes furniture. Well, since that's the case, purchases of these items are going to be sensitive to real interest rates. Lower the real interest rates, more likely, or the more you might spend on a car or a home or appliances or these so-called durable goods. What about depreciation of the currency? That's going to increase net exports. Import prices up, export prices down. Well, a little later in economics, we'll talk about the international economics in some of this, but for our purposes now, a depreciation in the currency means it's less valuable relative to another currency. So if the current exchange rate were $1 and, let's make it $1 and, I'll start over. Here, I can start over this way. Let's say it's $1.30 US per euro. Well, if the US dollar depreciates, that means this number goes up. If the US dollar gets less valuable relative to the euro, then maybe it takes $1.32 to buy a euro. So an increase in that number right there, that's a depreciation of the currency. So what's the effect of this on imports and exports? And it's pretty straightforward. Okay? Something that costs 100 euros after the depreciation is going to cost more than that. Okay? 100 euros worth of goods initially costs $130 US. After the depreciation of the exchange rate, it's going to cost $132. So imports are now looking more expensive in US dollar terms to US consumers. But to consumers in Euroland or the Eurozone, US goods prices are now less in euros. So that's why we say with a depreciation of the currency, import prices for U.S. buyers are up, export prices to Eurozone consumers have gone down. And so that's going to change net exports. Well, which way is it going to change it? Okay. Well, we'll import less stuff because prices are up. We'll export more stuff because prices are down. And that's going to make our balance of trade look better. Exports increasing, imports decreasing. Remember, this is simply X minus M. So those are all the things that can shift the aggregate demand curve. What about aggregate supply? Well, a decrease in input prices is going to increase short-run aggregate supply, An increase in wages and other input prices is going to decrease it. Remember, I said that's our mechanism for getting back to long-run equilibrium. And we said improved expectations about the future drive businesses to plan to produce more. Decreases in business taxes make the business more profitable. They want to expand. Increases in business subsidies certainly would make a business want to expand and want to sell more. If the government says, you know those things you're selling? Yeah, we'll give you $10 every time you sell one. We say, well, great. I can lower my price and sell more and make more profits. Okay. And currency appreciation that reduces the cost of imported inputs. So say we held the dollar price of oil constant I said this wrong. Say we've got oil priced in euros, okay, and the U.S. dollar appreciates relative to the euro, then that input is less expensive in dollar terms, and as with decreasing the cost of any input, that's going to increase short-run aggregate supply. Now, what about long-run aggregate supply? Well, these are the same factors that grow an economy. If we have an increase in labor supply, we got more labor, same capital stock, we can have more output. If we have increased availability of natural resources, that can shift long-run aggregate supply. More physical capital, as we build up more physical capital over time, that can increase the full employment rate of GDP, the amount of long-run aggregate supply. And not just labor numbers, but with more education, more skills, more training, more experience, the labor force gets more valuable. We call this additional value human capital. And when we have more of that, we can produce more goods and services with the same capital stock. And advances in technology. I mean, that's what advances in technology mean, really, in production, is that I can take the same resources and get more stuff out of it. So I can take the same physical capital, the same labor and human capital, put it together and get more stuff. So over time, this long-run aggregate supply curve, which we also call full employment GDP or potential GDP, is going to increase over time. It's going to increase as the labor supply increases, as the stock of physical capital increases, as the labor force gets more skilled, and also as technology advances. That long-run aggregate supply is going to shift out to the right. Our economy is growing. The productive power of the economy is growing. Now let's show why we want this aggregate supply, aggregate demand curves here. And we're going to start out here with two short-run disequilibrium situations. In the first one, we're at below full employment. Think of this as being a recession. Recession because we're under, let me put FE here, we're under full employment GDP for whatever reason. Here's the price level. Here's the level of real output. Now, what did I say the mechanism was to get us back to long-run equilibrium? Well, we've got to move that short-run curve over time. And the idea is in a recession, higher unemployment, lower use of productive inputs, these prices should fall. And that's what the classical economists said. They said, oh yeah, if we get down here, if we have a recession, we have a business cycle swing to less than full employment GDP, what's going to happen is wages and other input prices are going to fall. And decreases in those input prices does what to aggregate supply? It increases it. So it's going to shift it out to the right here, which I think is animated. Let's see. Start out there, get downward wage pressure, excuse me, and that shifts us out to a new short-run aggregate supply curve, and we're back in equilibrium. So let's look at what that movement was again. because, let me clean up my mess here, because we start out here at this price level and this output, as wages and the prices of other inputs decrease, short-run aggregate supply increases like this, and our price level falls to here, and our output gets back to this full employment level along our long-run aggregate supply. So that's what the classical economists said. Everything's fine. Input prices adjust when we get into disequilibrium situations. So now let's look at a above full employment short-run disequilibrium. We were above full employment GDP, which is a temporary condition. And we're holding input prices constant and plotting this short-run aggregate supply curve. So there's our equilibrium at GDP 1 and price level 1. So now we're looking at an expansionary economy. And as we get to over full employment, we're going to have upward pressure on wages and other inputs as companies compete for them. When the economy is growing very rapidly, economic activity is growing rapidly, there's more demand for oil, there's more demand for electricity, there's more demand for labor. As these prices rise, what happens to short-run aggregate supply? Well, when input prices rise, it's going to decrease, and we'll see that as a shift to the left on this, which gets us back. So prices went up, and output went down, and we're back on long-run aggregate supply in long-run equilibrium. So that's an important story we're going to use when we talk about monetary and fiscal policy. At over full employment, we've got inflation, input prices go up, short-run aggregate supply decreases, the economy calms down, and we get back to full employment equilibrium. On the other hand, with a recession over here, we had downward pressure on wages and other input prices, which shifted aggregate demand this way as those prices fell and got us back to here. So the price level went up over here as we returned to equilibrium. Price level went down over here. So now we're going to start out at long-run equilibrium. Everything's in great shape here. We're on short-run aggregate supply curve, input prices in equilibrium. We've got a determined price level, and we've got our full employment level of GDP. Now, what happens if something increases aggregate demand? Well, what could do that? Well, we went through a list of that. Okay, better expectations about the future, people feeling wealthier, okay, that whole list of things, increase in government spending. So what happens if we start at equilibrium, and let's say they increase government spending? Say we're going to grow this economy, we're going to increase government spending, deficit spending. So that shifts this aggregate demand curve out like that. Well, what does our equilibrium do? Well, we move along the short-run aggregate supply curve. There's no reason to move that. And now what do we have? Well, we've got upward pressure on wages and other input prices. That upward pressure that increases those input prices reduces short-run aggregate supply, as you saw on the graph. It shifts back. These input prices rise, wages rise, until we're back on long-run equilibrium. But I want you to see the overall effects. If you let me please go backwards here. Starting out at equilibrium, if the government increases aggregate demand through either fiscal or monetary policy, shifts it out like that, the price level rose, didn't it? And in the short run, we got an increase in output. But what happens in the long run? Well, remember what determines long-run aggregate supply. It's the capital stock, it's human capital, it's labor and technology. Well, none of that has been affected by the government or monetary authorities trying to shift this aggregate demand curve out. We're at temporarily over full employment, but in the long run, input prices rise. When input prices rise because of competition for inputs at over full employment, it shifts this short-run aggregate supply curve to the left. We get a new equilibrium. Prices went up again, but what was the effect on real output in the long run? In the long run, no effect on real output of shifting that aggregate demand out, increasing aggregate demand when it's already at long-run equilibrium on the long-run aggregate supply curve. Excuse me. What happens if aggregate demand decreases? Well, remember the story of the classical economists is whatever the reason for this decrease in aggregate demand, this puts downward pressure on prices. So initially our move from here to here decreases the price level in the short run and decreases GDP in the short run. And now we're going to get a similar in the long run. Input prices fall. Short-run aggregate supply shifts out to the right, increases as money wages fall. Prices fell again, the price level fell again, but we got right back to where we started on long-run aggregate supply at full employment. So that's the equilibrating mechanism. Gets us, it's changes in these input prices. And remember, this price level here is the price of output. What we're fooling around here with is the price level for inputs. And we've said those stay the same in the short run, but adjust in the long run. So those are important points to remember when we get to monetary and fiscal policy. And stagflation here, well, stagflation, that's just two words put together, right? Stagnation and inflation. And stagflation says, well, the economy is, growth-wise, is doing poorly, but we still have inflation. So it's just like we saw in that last slide, some decrease in aggregate demand, aggregate supply, a supply shock. We start here, and a supply shock decreases short-run aggregate supply. Like an oil embargo, a sharp increase in the price of one productive input, something like this. That shifts back this, we get to under full employment, but there's also been an increase in the price level. So decrease in economic output, unemployment is rising, and yet the price level is rising as well. Well, if the government steps in, and the monetary authorities or the government say, you know what we've got to do is we've got to increase aggregate demand. We've got to get back to long-run aggregate supply like, say, before the election. And so if they do that, if they attempt to move aggregate supply up like this, what's the effect of that? Well, that can get us back to long-run aggregate supply, back to full employment GDP here, but it increases the price level again. So let's look at our notes on the right-hand side. Price level rise to P1, output declines to GDP1. That was our first move. The government can address inflation by trying to cool the economy down. They can address recession by trying to heat the economy up, but they don't have any tool that's going to reduce inflation and increase economic activity. And it can take a long and difficult time for wages and input prices to fall. The classical economists said, oh, yeah, they'll fall pretty quickly and we'll get right back to long-run equilibrium. Well, it turned out not to be the case, especially during the Great Depression in the U.S. We found out that we can be at under full employment significantly for prolonged periods, and this really went against what the classical economists said, and that's where Keynes and the Keynesians came in, and they said, no, you really have to shift up aggregate demand. If you sit around waiting for these input prices to fall, you're going to have a long and difficult road because they're sticky. They're not going to fall, at least not fall rapidly enough to get us back to full employment equilibrium. So the government can come in and shift aggregate demand by increasing spending, reducing interest rates, things like that. That raises price level further and just gets us back where we started. If they want to fight the inflation, then they have to go the other way. That's going to aggravate unemployment and reduce overall economic output. So now we're going to talk a little bit about growth economics. And what are the sources of economic growth? Well, that long-run aggregate supply was our measure of the output of the economy when it's at full employment. So the same things that move that long-run aggregate supply curve are going to increase economic growth. If our labor supply grows, we can produce more stuff. If there's more natural resources, we can produce more stuff. If we had more physical capital, productive machinery, we could produce more stuff. And if the labor pool, labor force, was higher quality, had a higher level of skill, we could produce more. And if technology improves, we can produce more. And we've seen over time, even in our lifetimes, sometimes technology moves very rapidly, and it can be industry to industry. We've seen a great increase in technology that's increased the productive capacity for oil and especially natural gas. Okay? But we can also have technologies such as the introductions of better communications, better computing power, everything like that, that has really raised productivity across the economy. So those are the 5 factors that can move the long-run aggregate supply, and those are also the sources of economic growth, growth in the output, real output of an economy overall. So we need to define something called sustainable growth. Well, our potential GDP, or full employment GDP, if we take aggregate hours worked times labor productivity measured as value of output per hour, then it's clear to see that if we multiply those two things together, we'll get total potential output. This is going to grow from growth in the labor force and growth in labor productivity. Now, we talked about growth in capital, but now we've captured that in labor productivity. Because if you take a day of labor and give that worker more capital to work with, it's going to be more productive. Now, long-term equity returns, returning to finance from economics just briefly, long-term equity returns are dependent on sustainable growth. Look, equity prices are the value of the companies, the corporations, at least the listed ones, publicly traded ones within an economy. As that economy grows, the value of that equity is going to grow as well. So, and historically speaking, long-term equity returns are closely related to growth in the overall productive capacity of the economy. So we've got a couple approaches now. We've got 2 approaches we want to look at to analyzing growth economics is what we're looking at here. And we've got a couple of approaches, pretty straightforward. Let me take you through this one right here. Y is our aggregate economic output. This is the amount of labor, and that's the amount of capital. So we've got this function of labor and capital, and we think output is increasing in labor and increasing in capital, right? So positively related to both of those arguments in the function. And then we've got that A term, that's total factor productivity. The increase in output above what we got from increasing labor and increasing capital. So advances in technology would certainly end up in that multiplier there, total factor productivity. So total output equals the output based on this output function for labor and capital as its two inputs, and this multiplier, total factor productivity. Okay, that was straightforward. Now we're going to fool around with that equation a little bit. We're going to divide both sides by L. And if we divide both sides by L, we see that this is a function of how much capital per each unit of labor. The idea is you take an amount of labor and start adding capital goods. The productivity goes up and up and up. But because of diminishing marginal productivity as we hold the quantity of one input constant and keep adding more and more and more of another input, at some point these gains from workers having more machinery starts to decrease. I mean, we start out with labor, and let's say we want to do some farming, and we get them some hoes and shovels instead of sticks, productivity goes up. Okay. Now we get them a plow and a couple of oxen, productivity is going to go up. Well, now we get them a newly designed plow and some other machinery that can be pulled behind horses, and productivity goes up. Well, now we give them a John Deere tractor, nice air-conditioned, stereo, radio back to the house to call for lunch, laser sighting to keep you straight on the field. Yeah, productivity per worker is certainly going to go way up again. But you can see there's limits to that. And maybe based on technology, but at this point, what more? You know, how much more could we get from a bigger tractor or a faster tractor or another tractor, given that we're holding other inputs constant? Well, not a whole heck of a lot. So we have diminishing marginal productivity of capital as we add more and more capital to a fixed amount of labor in terms of productivity gains. So now we can break this down into our components of economic growth. The weight in capital and the weight in labor is their factor shares of the output, right? If in a simple economy we define it as just two inputs, capital and labor. Well, capital gets paid some of the output, and labor gets paid the rest of the output. So those are the weights, the percentage of national income that capital and labor are getting. So the growth in this long-run aggregate supply curve, this growth in potential GDP, take the factor share of capital and multiply it by the growth in capital. Take the factor share in labor and multiply it by the growth in labor. Now let's look at a per capita growth model. That's a measure that many economies use, right? Because if we go back here we're talking just about potential GDP. And we say, well, there's a growth in the labor supply. Well, what if a country doubles its labor supply and increases full employment GDP by 50%? Well, individually, people in the economy are worse off. So that's the reason we want to look at output per capita. That's a good measure, an often used measure of economic progress. So we say, well, in that dividing everything by L, that's one way to approach it. Growth in per capita potential GDP, take the growth in technology and add to it the growth in the capital to labor ratio. Now, in developed countries, that capital to labor ratio is high. That's how they became developed countries. And when it's high, we get diminishing marginal returns to additional capital. So, in this growth economics framework, we're going to say that if you want more growth in per capita GDP, once you hit these high levels of capital per worker that we have in developed countries, additional growth is going to have to come from this piece right here, technological advancement. So that's one of the key takeaways from that view of growth economics. Let's take a look at a numerical example of this total productivity. I mean, the math is certainly not challenging. We need to remember the formula, but it gives us some insights into this model so we understand it better. Okay. Here was our formula. It said the growth in potential GDP equals change in total factor productivity. Okay. And here we have labor's share of national income, 70%. That means that capital's share of national income, so this is WC, has got to be 30%. Well, we've had a 6% increase in the labor force and a 5% increase in the capital stock. So we plug those in, and what do we find? Well, we find that total factor productivity equals 1.3%. Because 70% times 6%, well, that's 4.2% there. And 30% times 5%, well, that's going to be, 1.5% there. Add those up and get 5.7. Well, overall, we saw an increase of 7% in output. So 4.2 of that came from the increase in the labor force. And 1.5% of that increase in output came from growth in the capital stock. All the rest of it came from this total factor productivity. And typically we think of that as an improvement in technology. Okay, one last problem here I'd like you to wrestle with, help cement some of these ideas so you can carry them along with you. When the economy is operating at full employment GDP, the short-run and long-run effects of an increase in the rate of growth of the money supply are too. Well, we know about equilibrium in the money market. Increase in the growth rate of the money supply, at least in the short run, decreases real interest rates, increases production, output. But remember from our graphs, in the long run, because we're starting at full employment. So we increase the growth rate of the money supply, that increases aggregate demand. And we shift up that short-run aggregate supply curve. So in the short run, real GDP is going to increase. But what did we say happens in the long run? In the long run, because we started at full employment, that's where we're going to get back to. We lose that short-term increase in real GDP, and prices go up more. So B, I think, is our correct answer. Let's make sure. Yeah, it's the right answer. What's wrong with A? Decrease real interest rates in the short run? Yeah, that's fine. Increase real GDP in the long run? No, 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 no. You can't increase real GDP by printing money, not when you're starting at full employment. And C says increase the price level and real GDP in both the short and long run. Well, that's wrong here because in the long run, we aren't going to increase real GDP. So aggregate demand increases. We get to over full employment in the short run. That increases those wage pressures. Input prices go up. Short run aggregate supply decreases. Output declines in the long run, and prices go up a little bit more. So this increase in the money supply starting at full employment GDP is going to translate all into higher prices in the long run with no long run gains in the potential output, the actual output in terms of real goods and services of the economy. So we'll see some of this when we look at monetary and fiscal policy a little later in the curriculum.